So we're going to talk about the court of Juan of Castile, who you see here in this unattributed, undated portrait, but we do know it's him. His name is there, and of course his coat of arms, his shield is here with Castile and Leon. And he presided over, he ruled over this pretty significant chunk of Spain, modern day Spain. He was king for most of his life. He actually inherited the title when he was about a year old, but Castile was run by his uncle and his mother before he took it over, really kind of at the age of 13. So even though he didn't have a long life, he had a very long reign. And what's interesting about Castile, how this will differ from Aragon that we looked at last week, is that, first of all, Castile was incredibly wealthy. And whereas in Aragon they were looking pretty much to the Italian artists, they had a literal toehold in Italy, in Naples, and so they obviously had what was coming down the peninsula. These Castilian rulers, both Juan and his daughter Isabella I, of course, whom we'll be speaking about tonight, were looking to the north almost exclusively. And among the favorite artists of Juan of Castile, Juan II, was Rogier van der Weyden. So we're still not going to see the deposition tonight, that comes next week, but we will be seeing a lot of Rogier's work this evening. By 1450, really the majority of the art, the architecture, the sculpture in the major churches was being done by northern artists, and the commissions were going to northern artists. So primarily Flemish, some really kind of French as well. And the other big difference is that whereas the Aragonese, Alfonso V, was acquiring the work of Flemish artists, Juan was actually commissioning them, and certainly so was his daughter. So again, two very big differences. And what we're going to see, because we will be discussing Castilian artists as well, is that ultimately they create this hybrid of work that is very northernly influenced, some Italian, but primarily northern. And so we're going to start to see this unique style that's forged from all of these different influences that's going to ultimately lead to what will eventually be the Golden Age in Spain. Now, here we've got Juan's daughter, Isabella I, and her of Castile, and her husband, Ferdinand I of Aragon. So we're starting to see this consolidation of land, of territories, and as you can see, they're not the most good-looking couple out there, are they? And so we're going to see probably why they were very eager for their daughter, Juana, to marry somebody named Philip the Handsome next week. See if they could inject something into the gene pool there. But both of these portraits, it's believed, were done by Michel Citeaux, who was their court artist. He came to the court in March of 1492. Now, 1492, we all know, aside from Columbus sailing the ocean blue, was a very major year in Spain. The Reconquista was complete in January of 1492. Isabella and Ferdinand had driven the Nasrid kingdom out of Granada, and Spain was now a completely Christian peninsula. And it wasn't Spain as we know it today, but the region was exclusively Christian, at least under the rulership. And of course, in March of 1492 is when the Jews were expelled, the official expulsion from Castile and Aragon and basically everywhere else. We're going to talk more about the Jewish community in Spain as we go through the evening. But Michel Citeaux was born in Tallinn in modern-day Estonia. He went to Bruges from around 1484 to 1491, so he had a good 6 years absorbing the styles of what was going on. And his influences, as many of these artists, came from manuscript illumination. These are small portraits. They are about 8 by 5, tiny, tiny. And after Isabella's death, he's going to go back to the Burgundian court. He's going to work for Margaret of Austria and her brother Philip the Fair, and we will be talking a lot more about Philip the Fair next week. Margaret, among her many titles, is governor of the Hapsburg Netherlands, and of course that's going to become increasingly significant for us. Among her favorite court artists was an artist, Juan de Flan, John of Flanders, very descriptive names, whose dates are around 1460 to 1519. Not much is known about his early life. He starts appearing in the court ledgers around 1496, and he's going to remain active at the court until Isabella's death. just like Citeaux, and she passes away in 1504. Now, what's significant is all the literature mentions that these artists were active at the court until the death of Elizabeth, notwithstanding the fact that her husband outlived her by 13 years. So clearly, she was the driving force. She was the one commissioning artists, not Ferdinand as much. Ferdinand Gallego is another artist we're going to talk about tonight, and Gallego is actually from Salamanca, and we're going to see how the influences of all of these artists are going to really start forming what's a uniquely Spanish vernacular. He was active in the last quarter of the century from about 1475 to 1507. Gilles de Soloé from 1440 to 1501 are his dates, but he also came from up north, either from Orléans or Antwerp, so Orléans, modern-day France, or Antwerp in modern-day Belgium. And he is going to become the leading sculptor in Castile at the time. His son Diego, whose influences are much more Italian, will succeed him. And so a lot of the work we're going to talk about was started by Gilles, ended by Diego, and then to just throw a complete monkey wrench into it, it was painted by another Flemish artist named Diego de la Cruz. So a lot of Diegos, none of whom were Spanish-born. Diego de la Cruz was active from around 1482 to 1500, and he worked with Soloé. Another Spaniard, Pedro de Bourgogne, is going to present a fusion of Italianate work with Flemish work. He worked at the court of, in our Urbino, of Federico de Montefeltro, the Duke of Urbino, from around 1475 to 1480. Those of you who have been to Urbino know that the famous thing of Montefeltro's palace is the Studiolo, and that's where Bourgogne was working. And then finally, we'll get to Juan De Bourgogne, whose dates are around 1470 to 1434. The first mention of him in Spain is in 1495, and he worked very much with Bourgogne. And what is really significant is after the Reconquista of 1492, there's just, probably not surprisingly, a huge amount of church building, church decoration, church commissions happening across the country. And what we're going to look at, what I talked about last week, is that you had these sculptors who were really working throughout the country. And so how I've broken it up tonight, rather than per artist, is talking about these different regions. We're going to start way up in Burgos, go to Palencia, Salamanca, Avila, and then down to Toledo. So we're going to hopscotch across the country. One thing I'll just point out once I've got the map up, and again, this is this great 17th century map. So this is all of Castile, this big, big central area. And then, of course, Aragon here, here and out to Italy, and then Granada, the holdout that was finally conquered in 1492. So we are going to start in Burgos. Now, how many of you, I know Alita's done this, how many of you have walked the Camino and stopped in Burgos? All right, a couple of you. And so you know that Burgos was a very important stop on the Camino de Santiago. So anyone who walks the path, walks the route to Santiago de Compostela in western Spain will stop at Burgos. It was then, as now, a significant, important stop on the route. It, in those days, had more hostels and more places to stay than any other place on the Camino. They had 32 different hostels. Now, that's ELS, not ILES. But it also had the most art, pretty much, on the Camino as far as actual things to see. It was a really important administrative area. It was a commercial town. It had commercial professions. It had not only ecclesiastical offices, but also government offices, as well as it needed money changers. It needed a whole tourist infrastructure. Obviously, if you've got all of those inns, you need people to run them. And, you know, we take it for granted now, the whole hospitality industry, but a lot of it was really formed with these early pilgrimage routes. And so what's the way you're going to show, if you're the ruler of Castile, that you're powerful and you're great, is you're going to endow as many buildings as you can. And so we're going to look first at the charter house of Miraflores, which is 3 kilometers outside of Burgos. One other point I just want to make about Burgos is it's said that it's 9 months of winter and 3 months of hell. So having never been there, I don't know if any of you can attest to that, but clearly they needed sort of they needed something to do besides agriculture. And so they had that. It was also a very cosmopolitan city. It had foreigners, not only as artists, but just as in Flanders they had agents from all over Europe, so too did they have that in Burgos. There was a Muslim community, there was a Jewish community, and so you had this very cosmopolitan society there. The charter house had been a hunting lodge for Juan II's father, Henry III of Castile, known as the Mourner. And when he died, Juan donated it to the Carthusians, and this was in 1441. It was their first Carthusian charter house in Spain. A fire destroyed it. This is not the original. It was rebuilt in 1452. And by this time, Isabella had ascended to the throne. So as you can see, it's kind of a smallish building. One of the things she really wanted to create was a royal necropolis. She wanted it to be a place where the royalty of Spain could be interned in perpetuity, much like Saint-Denis had been. And if you recall, Saint-Denis in Paris, outside of Paris, did become a royal necropolis, and it was under the architecture of Abbot Suger, the abbot there. And he almost single-handedly created a Gothic style. So I don't know if the intention was in so creating this royal resting place to also create a unique style, but it is still pretty Gothic-y looking. We've got these Gothic spires here and this wonderful tracery. What she also commissioned was a tomb for her parents, seen right here, and a tomb for her brother, seen here, and this spectacular retablo. And I apologize for pirating a stock photo, but it was the only one I could find that had all of these wonderful elements in it. The style is done in what's known as the Flamboyant Gothic style. So at the time, this architecture was just known as modern style. It wasn't until the 19th century that it got the pejorative name of Gothic, but it was just known as French style or modern style at the time. And one of the elements of it is this, again, just lovely tracery that we saw in the work of Rachir last week in his paintings. And then these wonderful little faces that adorn this the eastern end of this church. And here's this tomb that she had commissioned for her parents. Her mother, Isabel of Portugal, not the same Isabel of Portugal we talked about last week. That was Isabel of Portugal, Duchess of Burgundy. This is just Isabel of Portugal, who was married to Juan II. So if this is blowing your mind, I know, join the club. I mean, I had like all these different family trees up because there are a lot of Isabels of Spain, Isabel of Portugal. But this is who her parents were. But this very wonderful kind of mixed style. This was by Gilles de Silouet. It was done around 1489 to 1493 in alabaster. So alabaster is not indigenous to Northern Europe, but it is available in Southern Europe and certainly North Africa. It's a much softer stone, easier to carve. And you can see here this blend of Islamic and Christian or Gothic-y French style work all the way around. So he's carved all these wonderful decorations. It's on an 8-point kind of star, which owes its origin more to Islamic art. So it's a style known as mudahar, which was very indigenous to Iberia. And then to give you an idea, so here's the king, here's the queen. I love that they've got a little, screen, a barrier between them, so they shouldn't do anything they shouldn't be doing. These were painted at one point. There's still traces of paint on the king's face. And some of the sculptures have been, appropriated by others through the years. And so, for example, right near the Queen's head, you had this wonderful little sculpture of Santiago, which is now at the Cloisters in New York. So you can go see it relatively easily. But it's very much in the style of, any of you remember the Mourners exhibition that was at the DMA a couple of years ago, that was basically the Dukes of Burgundy, and they were these small little figures, the pleurants, the crying figures, but it's this very northern tradition of having these little figures. Having Santiago, St. James, makes perfect sense. This is on the pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela. He is dressed as a pilgrim, and so anyone who would have come into this charter house would have immediately recognized it, not only as Santiago, but also as a pilgrim. He's got the pilgrim sack, he's got the shell and the staff, and you get a sense of some of the paint, this wonderfully painted on design on this magnificent sculpted little figure. And then this is the tomb of her brother Alfonso, also by Silouet, Prince Alfonso. Also done in alabaster, very, very Gothic. If those of you who have been to France or even Spain, and you've seen all these little figures on the door jambs, here they are again. You've got these crazy, flying, kind of harpy-looking, demon-y figures, and then these little putti here. But just very, very elaborate, very ornamented, and very kind of unique to that time. Now let's look at this retablo, at this altarpiece, which is just crazy, especially since so many of these artists had their beginnings in manuscript illumination, right? So suddenly you're going from something that's this big or this big on the outer ends to something like this. And so whereas some of the inspiration may have come from that, the other inspiration came from Flemish tapestry weaving. And if you sort of, when I worked at the DMA in education, they would say, have us tell the kids, blur your eyes to see how this would look. And I think if you would blur your eyes on this, you might be able to get a sense of the same elements that you had in the tapestries, certainly with all the gilt that's in here, without a U. And that gold is all coming to the charter house courtesy of Christopher Columbus. When he came back on his second trip, this was kind of the shiny object, quite literally, that he brought back. And here it's being used in this royal charter house. Very northern in that you've got this cast of thousands. I love this ring around Christ that's made up of all these angels. You've got Christ here, held up by God the Father. It's believed this is the Holy Ghost. Scenes from the life of Christ, and then the pelican up top, the symbol of sacrifice. And then on the lower registers, you've got the John the Evangelist, St. Matthew, St. Mark here, and St. Luke. But very northern in that you've still got these banderoles that are telling you, I wish I knew what he was copying onto this incredible band. If he's already written it, what's he copying from? The other lovely little element here is this weight on the book. It's hard. It looks like an ink well. At first I thought it might be a cowbell on St. Luke, but I don't think that's it. I think it's just something, a heavy weight on the book. But beautifully painted, and imagine what it had to be like to paint and install this in the late 15th century. And then in the corners that we're going to see, that did not translate too well. We're going to see Juan of Castile, Isabel of Portugal. The arrest, this comes from right here, but certainly seeing a detail of it is much nicer than trying to make it out from this far. Again, you've got your Gothic architecture, and all of these figures just crammed in here. And then on the bottom registers, you've got Juan II with John the Baptist, his patron saint, here. Mary Magdalene, who was favored by the Carthusians. And then you've got a detail. Again, look at this gorgeous gold robe. I can't tell what that imprint is. It kind of looks like shoes, but I think I'm just sort of bringing my own baggage to that. Hard to say what that is. And then Isabel of Portugal on the other side. With St. James, Santiago again. and her coat of armor. You've got his coat of arms here, Castile and Leon, and then hers grafted onto his. And then Catalina, who is one of her patron saints as well. So again, a lot of times with these, Gilles de Siloé would begin the work, his son Diego would finish it. And again, Diego had studied in Italy, and then he returned to Burgos, where he spent his life really working as an architect and sculptor. So that was Isabella who commissioned this. This is a commission that her father put forth, and this is Rogier van der Weyden's Miraflores Altarpiece, which, in spite of its name, is now in Berlin, as are many treasures. So each panel, that's the one thing I didn't put on your slide list if you're interested, each panel is 28 by 17 inches. It's really not that big. It's certainly nothing like the retablo we just saw. And this is sort of the give and take that you're dealing with, is these northern artists are used to working on these very small scales. Most of their altarpieces close, so the grisaille would be on the outside, which is what you'd have most of the time, and then on saints' days, feast days, you would open it up for all this wonderful color. And in the case of these that we're going to Spain, you just have an altarpiece. This is it. And if it's small, and then the retablos, of course, speak for themselves because they're gigantic. And this was also supposed to go in the same end of the apse that we saw the large retablo. So this was, picture this with everything else. And again, you still have this Gothic-y tracery in the work, so it would have fit in perfectly. Now, Rogier's primary interests are really the figures and the design elements, and he's really working in this style known as Ars Nova, new art. According to James Snyder, he, in his tome on Northern Renaissance art, he says that Rogier paints Mary as the good Flemish wife of noble background. And so this idea of almost, Flemish, northern women you get in a lot of his work, and that's going to keep translating. He also mentions this connection to theater, and mystery plays were certainly gaining steam at this time. And so these have kind of a stage-like quality to them. Each one relates to everything in it. There's nothing really left to chance in here. So you've got the Holy Family here with a royal kind of a background in kind of an old, almost Romanesque looking building. And this is a very common thing that you'll see in a lot of work from this era, that things that take place in the Old Testament or that are older have the barrel vaults of Romanesque architecture, and things that are more current or sort of after Christ's death, you've got in Gothic architecture. And then you've also got these wonderful little angels sort of telling their story with their banderols. You've got the archivolts here that echo what's going on. So here you've got obviously Mary, you've got the Annunciation here, the meeting of Mary's parents. Oh, I'm sorry, here's the Annunciation, the meeting of Mary's parents, presentation in the temple, etc. So each of these archivolts are very thought through. The other thing that you start seeing in a lot of the work that goes to Spain is you start seeing a stronger presence of Joseph. And what will be interesting is that in the north, Joseph is almost viewed as a buffoon. He's just this old guy who is kind of the lackey on Mary's arm. But in Spain, you start to see him, even with the northern artists, as having a much more prominent role. And what will continue to happen as we get even through the Golden Age is that you'll start seeing Joseph as being portrayed as younger and younger and younger, and really almost heroically. And so it's interesting where this ultimately leads. So these are the two side panels. You've got the Joys of the Virgin with the Holy Family, the Glories of the Virgin on the far right of the Final Farewell. And in the first panel, she's wearing white for purity. In the final panel, she's wearing blue for faith. The background here also connects to the foreground, because here you've got something that almost looks like the cross, but it's not. And then you've got the resurrection going on back here. And again, for something that's really 28 inches high, that's a lot to pack in there. And then is Pietà. And I brought this one individually because This is sort of the theme of this evening. You're going to be seeing this Pietà quite often. And so what I need you to remember is in this one, Mary is wearing red. And red, of course, for the Passion. And and then you've got John the Baptist and this sort of faux Jerusalem in the background. And then once again, you've got the cross, this T-shaped cross that we're going to see over and over again. So this is the center panel. Again, you've got Mary holding Christ. Very compressed. You know, when we get to the deposition that we'll see next week by Rogier, you know, you've got a cast of thousands who are getting Christ off the cross. But here it's a very personal, very family event. John the Baptist is his cousin. Joseph, I don't think this is Joseph of Arimathea. I think this is Joseph, his father, and of course his mother. Okay. And we are seeing in this banderole, you know, Mary is going to get the crown of glory as well for her purity.
Is it rather rare to have Joseph?
Yes, as a matter of fact, it is. You never see him in a Pietà. No. And again, it's hard to tell if this was an invention of Rogier or if Juan of Castile said, I'd like to include Joseph. We have no way of knowing, unfortunately. But yeah, you never see him in a Pietà. He's at the Nativity and then he's gone. So Isabella's father commissioned this. Isabella commissioned what is known as the Politic of Isabella the Catholic, or also known easier as the John the Baptist altar, which was gigantic. It had 47 panels, all of which were tiny, and these are two of them. So it's been taken apart. It's been scattered to the winds. These are by Citeaux, these two, or at least they're attributed to him. The Assumption of the Virgin on the left, and the Coronation of the Virgin. The one on the left is in the National Gallery in Washington, and the one on the right in the Louvre in Paris. And I wish I have not been able to find anything that schematically puts them together, which would be a shame, because these are two such different stories. I mean, they are both of sort of what happens to Mary at the end, but they're done in very, very different styles. Again, quite small. I love this one of Mary, the Coronation of Mary. I mean, here she is. She's in front of her son, you know, in a very regal, in a very courtly way, pledging her allegiance. That's where this notion of prayer comes from, the Middle Ages, for pledging one's allegiance. And of course, about to receive the crown of glory right here. Now, of the 27 panels that still exist, 2 of them are attributed to Citeaux. And you can see that, you know, he builds up his paint surfaces in a very translucent way, and this is going to change in Iberia as we go through. And then we've got this Pietà by Citeaux. We think, unless it's by Juan de Flan, and this is why I tell young artists to always sign their work, so that in 500 years we'll know who did it. But as you can see, this Pietà is a carbon copy. This is the one by Rogier that we just talked about. That's why I mentioned, remember that she wears red. And here Citeaux has completely copied it and reversed the colors. And this is much later. It's from 1500. Also not that big, about 20 inches by 14.5 inches. And this is in the Museum of the Royal Chapel in Granada, which is where Isabel and Ferdinand are interred. So a lot of work ends up in Granada. The other 25 panels we know are by Juan de Flan. Now, Juan de Flan is just a very colorful character who becomes a very, very rich man at the court of Isabella. We've got here the raising of the cross and the temptation of Christ. And again, these are tiny, so influence from manuscripts. Juan de Flan goes to work at the court, you know, late in the century, and we know that Isabella pays him handsomely. His first payment was for 6,000 maravedis. 3 months later, he's paid another 20,000 maravedis as an annual retainer. 3 months after that, he's given another 15,000, my favorite, his clothing allowance, so that he will be dressed befitting a courtier, member of the court, and on and on and on. Account books show that when he was at Miraflores for 8 months, of course, he had to be housed and he had to be fed, and the royal ledger paid 26,000 maravedis for this privilege. Overall, in the 8 years that he spent working for Isabella, he amassed a fortune of 350,000 maravedis. After her death, he goes to work for the Bishop of Palencia, Juan Rodriguez de Fonseca, and so he keeps working. So he is a very, very wealthy man. And the way we know this, a lot of this, is thanks to an art historian named Jessica Weiss, who wrote a paper in the Journal of Historians of Netherlandish Art relatively recently. She goes through all of the account ledgers, and she writes this paper called Juan de Flanders and his financial successes in Castile. And it's online. I haven't read the entire thing, but what I did read was, quite interesting, entertaining, and very, very insightful. Now, the interesting thing is both Citeaux and Juan de Flanders are influenced by two Flemish painters, Hugo van der Goes, whom I mentioned last time, and Gerard David. One of the things they both take from Hugo is his expressive figures and the use of hands. And I love this temptation of Christ. You sort of have the shape-shifting demon coming in the form of a monk, but he's got horns, so you know he's trouble, coming up to Christ to tempt him, and Christ like, yeah, it's okay, I'm good, sending him away. And this wonderful kind of weird craggy landscape that you see in a lot of northern paintings. Now, Northern Europe, if you've been to the Low Countries, there's a reason they're called the Low Countries. They are low, they are flat. And so, but they knew there were hills, they knew there were mountains, and so often you get this rendition of what mountains could be like, of what rocky outcroppings can be like, and you see that here. And then this nailing Christ to the cross is an image that we're going to see over and over, and we're going to return to it several times this evening. And it's taken from a Byzantine guidebook, a painting guide, that says that one should have a crowd of Jews and soldiers seen upon a mountain. So you see them, there's a mountain, there are hills there, a cross laid upon the ground in their midst, the body of Christ upon it. 3 soldiers hold it by ropes at the arms and feet. Other soldiers bring nails and drive them in with a hammer through his feet and hands. This has a bit of a medieval twist, however, because since this scene is not recounted in the Bible, it becomes very much a devotional scene. And when we look at the one, make sure this is, we'll come back to that. When we look at the image done by Gerard David on the same subject, it is very devotional. It's a small image. It is, let's see what this one is. Sorry. 19 by 37, so not big. Again, taken from manuscripts, sort of made a bit larger, but meant to be something for private devotion, that when one goes to one's chapel, one has Christ looking out at you, the viewer. You know, you think you've had it rough. Here I am, literally, here I am. And so we'll come back to that one in a moment. But you've got all of the same elements. You've got the guy at the foot of the cross, raising the cross by rope. This fellow putting in the nails. In this case, a very expressionless Christ. And again, if this thing had 47 panels, it could well be that this was on the top tier. And so it would have been really hard to make out to begin with. But you have a lot of these same elements. This lovely blue sky that you see in a lot of these images by Juan de Flanders. Now here you've got this gorgeous painting by Hugo van der Goes, the Montfort altarpiece, that it's now in Berlin. It was originally in a monastery in Galicia at the Montfort de Lemos. And this was originally a central panel to a triptych. And it's been cut down too. There were angels. They're not just these random bits of cloth, but there were angels above. This to me is almost the apotheosis of Northern painting. It is so magnificently beautiful. You've got the hand gestures that we talked about that influenced these other artists. This beautiful, tender image of Mary holding Christ's hand When do you ever see that? Never. These sumptuous robes, and look at this palette. It is so gorgeous, these reds and the plums and the blues. The blues are echoed here in these irises that relate to the Immaculate Conception. So they draw your eye back here, and then it goes back to here. But again, just these gorgeous northern robes that have been gathered up, in prayer. The fur hat, very much like if you remember to the Burgundian court, those big fur hats. Even the shoes have sort of the reminiscent pointy toe of earlier Burgundian paintings. But the greens, the blues there, the palette here is just so magnificent. And then the fur-lined cloak that we saw over and over again last week. And then there's just a little halo, beautiful shadow. So a lot of the elements that we saw last week, Hugo was still incorporating in this work that ended up in Spain originally. And here we've got the Gerard David one with the one by Juan de Flan. So you can see there, the one big difference is Juan de Flan's is, again, not looking outwards. But in this painting, you've got these incredible diagonals going this way and this way. So even though it's small, you still have this very strong pull with Christ really at the center of the two. You've got his cloak on the ground. Once again, the figure, this guy in boots, pulling up the rope. Wonderful little dog, and I think it's a cat. And then this guy who looks like he's quasi-official with the army. Once again, you've got the soldiers on a hill back behind them. And what we're going to see a lot tonight, last week we talked about Christ with his head leaning to one side. We're going to see a lot of these flattened Christs that are just, stretched right out this evening. And then this is one more piece that is at the Charterhouse Miraflores by Pedro Berruguete. The Annunciation, 1500. Oil on panel, as are the rest of these. He was born near Palencia, so he was a native son. And the style is still fundamentally Flemish. You've still got these figures in the niches. These look like Adam and Eve in Juan and Jan van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece. You've got these figures here. All of these Flemish little symbols, the clear glass vessel with the lilies representing the purity of Mary, the Gothic tracery here. But what you also have, because he had spent time in Urbino, is this magnificent interior, so much larger. If you think to the Ghent altarpiece and when the doors are closed, you've got Gabriel and Mary just compressed in this tiny little space. And here they are in kind of this big open space, this open area. Gabriel's even coming in through the door with these same great watermelon wings that we saw last week with his little banderole. And then, again, another great northern touch. This is not a little fault in the image. It's a homunculus. This is Christ coming in. Hail Mary, full of grace. You're going to be a mother, and Shazam. Whoops, sorry. And here he comes. So, and then the book, all the attributes that we traditionally see Mary with in the north are here. And then that little image that you see, again, in northern art. And beautiful carpet as well. Isn't that gorgeous? The palette's quite different. The colors are a little, for lack of a better word, a little clunkier. They're not quite as translucent. They're not quite as elegant and smooth as you see, certainly in the altar by Hugo. Now, also in Burgos is, of course, the cathedral. Those of you who have been there know this is a really pale representation of this gigantic cathedral, which you can see here. There is a wonderful book written by David Gitzlitz and his wife and travel partner, Linda K. Davidson, called The Pilgrimage Road to Santiago. It's a guidebook of sorts, and it talks about all the different things one will see along the way. And one of the things they recommend when going to Burgos is 6 hours to go through the cathedral. So I don't know, did you spend 6 hours there, Lud? Exactly. I don't know. So those of you who've been there, I mean, I'm sure it's just spectacular. Yeah. 6 hours is a long time. It's a long time to spend anywhere looking at art, even for me. But it's gigantic to give you a sense of scale. It's got a rose window. It's the third largest cathedral in Spain after Toledo and Seville. But if you would just look at this and not see the St. Christopher here, but if you just look at this, you could be in France very easily. It is a completely Gothic cathedral on the inside. And then here's a plan of it to give you an idea. So instead of just a regular cruciform plan, which is what most Gothic cathedrals are, it's like cruciform plus. And it's got 15 chapels radiating around the apse and the ambulatory. And then here's, again, one of these spectacular retablos. We're going to be looking mostly at this chapel up here, number 22, the Chapel of the Constable. And this, again, phenomenal retablo. Now, in this chapel, there were two big retablos, two big altarpieces, one by Gilles de Siloé, who worked on the altar of Santa Ana from 1486 to 1492. And the chapel was commissioned by the Constable of Castile, a man named Don Pedro Fernandez de Velasco, for he and his wife, Doña Mencia de Mendoza and Figura. So she was obviously a noble. They obviously had quite a bit of money. And they commissioned the leading artists of the day. So not only Gilles de Siloé, but another artist from the north named Philippe de Vijarny, or also known as Philippe de Bourgogne. So you will see his name any number of different ways, which is not particularly helpful to us, but we will keep him as Philippe de Vijarny. And this is the altar of Santa Ana that was painted by Diego de la Cruz. And you can see here is Ana and Joaquin. The tree of Jesse. So the tree of Jesse is very important. It establishes the family line of Christ. And you can see it's springing. Here's a wonderful detail. It is literally a family tree here. All these different kings. King David's on there. And it eventually winds its way up to Christ. So this was finished by Diego de Siloé, and Diego de la Cruz did the painting. This is, you've got a lot of Italian Renaissance here. This blue with the stars painted on it, that's what the Sistine Chapel looked like before Michelangelo got his hands on it. And the Arena Chapel, same thing. You've got just a blue background with stars, very Italian, but with this incredible Gothic architecture all over the top of it, and these beautiful polychrome figures all the way around it. And then this is the one by Philippe de Vijarny, who had gone to Italy in 1475, and these figures are a little more Italian. You've got these writhing figures of the two thieves on the cross. This Christ, however, looks a lot like the Christ we saw last week, with his head cocked to one side. Now, Vijarny, we know, he first came to Burgos as a pilgrim, actually, in 1498. So he got to see what was there. He was on his way to Santiago de Compostela. And, you know, he worked on this, and he worked on the high altar in the Cathedral of Toledo. So he's one of these artists who really made it all the way around Spain. If you do end up going to this cathedral, among the most famous couple there are El Cid and his wife, Doña Jimena. They were interred there, and they were moved there in 1921. So this is sort of the cathedral that has everything. Even the stained glass was done by a Flemish artist, an artist named Arnaud de Flan. And here you've got, once again, Santiago. He's got his pilgrim's bag, pilgrim's staff, book. Could be a Bible. It could also be a guidebook, because guidebooks were very popular at that time, as they are now. But the whole industry of creating guidebooks came about as the result of these pilgrimage routes to Santiago. And this, I believe, is probably Joseph, who, as you know, when he was presented, or he showed up to Mary. They were looking for a groom for Mary. His rod blossomed into a flower. And you sort of get that sense there, that that's a little more flora than wood. And then you have the work of a Castilian artist there as well. This is Alonso De Sedano. He had worked for the court of Aragon and Palma de Mallorca, so he was also introduced to Italian art there. And what you see in this particular work, this Adoration of the Magi, is a little bit of everything. You've got this Magus kissing the foot of Christ. You've got a kind of a much more of an Italianate-looking arch than Flemish. But then you've also got Flemish elements in here. You know, you've got this guy, this cap. If you know the work of Peter Bruegel, you've got all those peasants wearing that kind of a hat. You've got this very huge, voluminous Mary, Italian. So there's, again, it's kind of a little bit of everything. It also gives a bit of a nod to Rochier's St. Columba altar, which you see here. And to put the two of them side by side, you know, this one, again, very victorious, very Italian. It's a much upgraded manger from the one of Rochier, but the same sense of the Magus kissing either the foot or the hand of Christ in these two. And it's really believed that his client base was really more interested in this, sort of indigenous, the local client base, really in the interests and the religious aspects of the art rather than kind of the decorative or the formal aspects of the work. And then you've got his crucifixion here on the top from 1595 to 1596. And it's very compressed. You've got the same sense of, kind of squashing of Christ. But what's very different here is that when you look at the people who's surrounding him, in fact, he does have these Jewish executioners. And this is the first time we see them as being specifically Jewish. And what spells this out is they've got these tzitzis, these fringed garments that were and are still worn by very Orthodox men. And you wear your garments outside, hanging out of your pants. The other thing is that in Spain at this time, all of the clothing was very prescribed. So it was not like we have today, like what am I going to wear today? Depending on your social class, your social standing, that was what you wore. And so it was no coincidence that these executioners are seen wearing these fringed garments. They're also wearing red tights that at one point were also associated with the Jewish community. And the Jewish community in Spain, the beginning of the end really came in 1391 when there was this huge, horrible pogrom that took place across the country. The Inquisition was founded in 1480, but prior to that, in 1412, there were all these decrees on what Jews and Muslims could and could not wear. And among the decrees on the Jewish community, they had to wear a badge, they had to the men were not allowed to shave their beards or cut their hair, so they were supposed to have wild-like hair, which you sort of get a sense of here. They could not wear any sumptuous clothing, so all the clothing had to be very coarse, and basically lost all privileges to travel, to leave the country, to hold jobs, and were really put into this state of poverty. This was done right after the expulsion of the Jews, so there were really not even that many Jews left. And what's interesting to me is, this is a total aside, but as you all probably know, the new Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum is getting ready to open in downtown Dallas. I'm writing a story about it right now, and they've got a whole section on the 10 stages of genocide. And among those stages are wearing clothing, specific clothing, having things that identify people as that, whatever it happens to be. And the fact that this has been going on since the 14th century is really troubling, just in that nothing ever changes, unfortunately. The additions that he's got here, however, is he's added the skulls. So, in Spanish painting, you always see the skulls these represent Adam. They also represent Golgotha, where the crucifixion took place, which means place of skulls. So this is the first time you're really seeing it. You don't see it at all in these northern artists, but you're starting to see it in the Spanish artists. The other thing about this is it's really kind of a strange, he kind of did it backwards or sideways, because it makes sense that these guys are going to raise the cross. And so they've got a rope and they're going to raise it feet up, right? Well, I don't know what's going to happen here. Like, it's sort of like a sideways crucifixion. But he kind of did it backwards or sideways or something. And then you still have the figures on the hill. These could be a rendition of the high priest. You've got his cloak, Christ's cloak here. And again, this very flattened Christ, you know, against this tau-shaped cross, this T-shaped cross. So right now in this cathedral, you're seeing the work of sort of native sons, but also the work of all of these foreign artists. And really, the cathedral had the work by artists from all over Europe in it. Obviously, if you can spend 6 hours there, you can find work by artists of just about any nationality. So any questions before we leave Burgos? Okay. We will move on to Palencia. Now, as I mentioned, when Isabella died, Juan de Flan found a new patron in the Bishop of Palencia, Juan Rodriguez de Fonseca. And de Fonseca was a big, he and his family, he was a nobleman, not surprisingly, and he and his family were big patrons of the arts. When he took this position, there had already been plans in place for a new altarpiece in this cathedral. But he decided to finish it up, and he sort of brought in his own group, his own crew, and he commissioned Philippe De Bourgogne to design it, and Juan de Flan to do these paintings. And he commissioned him originally to do 10, but it was sort of didn't work out evenly, so there are actually 12 by Juan de Flan. And we're going to see this one and this one in a moment. Now, this bishop had worked for Isabella and Ferdinand, so he had contacts with northern artists. It was he who was sent to the north in 1504, 1505 to announce the death of Isabella. So he actually got to see northern work in situ. He got to surround himself with northern painting. And what he knew would be a challenge, even stated in the contract, was that the figures were supposed to be done in Roman style. And so you've got this little tug of war between Roman style, idealized Roman style basically means idealized figures that you see here, excuse me, and what he knew would be more Flemish type work here. And to give you an idea of some of these, and one of the note points that either James Snyder or Jonathan Brown makes is that these panels that Juan de Flan did were 5 times larger and 10 times longer than what he had done for Isabella. So for any of you who paint, we don't have Linda Ferguson in here tonight, but for any of you who paint, you know that going from something, if you're used to working in a small format, to something that's gigantic is a bit of a challenge, but one to which he actually rose quite well. And so these two images you've got of Christ carrying the cross from 1510, it's 46 by 58. So again, going from 8 by 5 to 46 by 58 is huge. And here you've got, he knew that Castilians liked to have sort of some local flavor in their work. And so what you have here is this laundress with her basket of coiled sheets, which was how sheets would be folded. But actually, who is she? What's she getting ready to do? Saint Veronica. So he's sort of positioned her as a laundress, and here she has a freshly cleaned handkerchief, and of course she's going to wipe Christ's face, and it will miraculously appear on here. This is a crack in the wood. It is not a clothesline or some other painting device. But these, again, you've got the very Flemish-looking soldiers here. This guy is very Flemish looking. Even his shoes are an upgrade to 16th century footwear. You see there? And then this really strange image among sort of all this gray, you've got the Virgin and John the Baptist placed back here, almost behind a barrier. And then the soldiers, and then these enigmatic little figures looking from a ruin. Again, in the resurrection, the same influence by Hugo of the hands. You see Mary Magdalene, so Christ is risen, right? And it's sort of like, hi, I'm back. And Mary Magdalene is like, what are you doing here? And he says, I've returned. Go tell the others. But very, very expressive. And again, in order to be able to read this from here, or where we are right now, to up there, it has to be exaggerated. You have to have a little overemphasis on the facial features and certainly on the hand gestures. And then just two more images, Gilles de Silouet on top of Ecce Homo, and then another by Philippe De Bourgogne of Christ and the Evangelist. So you still have your Italian stars in the sky with Christ surrounded by the Evangelists, which is much more Italianate, because if you think to Gothic cathedrals, you will often see this, but you will see them all in a mandorla, in this almond-shaped architectural device. But here they are sort of scattered across the heavens. And again, this emphasis on suffering, that you see Christ here, his face is swollen, his body is bloodied, his cloak is being held by a rope, not a silk tie, but an actual rope. And the sense of the suffering Christ is so prevalent, much more prevalent in the north than, say, this more Italianate figure that's kind of just attached to the column of the flagellation. And then finally, another painting by Pedro Berruguete, the Diptych of the Passion, which is also so Flemish in its execution. True, he does bring in the skulls. You've got these writhing figures on the thieves on the cross, and you know where this one's going, because he's got a demon just tugging, ripping his soul out. Seen here. And then on this side, this Pietà, which is very common, again, the same rigid figure of Christ that we saw with Rogier van der Weyden, and we will see this over and over again. Any questions before we continue on our grand tour of Castile and head to Salamanca? Salamanca has been a university town since the 12th century, and so everything about it is a little bit different, right? You've got academics there, you've got literate class there, and you've got people who are studying things from a lot of different areas. The first artist, or one of the first people, most important person we'll talk about from there, is Fernando Gallego, who was from that area. He was Castilian by birth. And this Pietà that you see here is his first known painting. We don't know who the donors are. Seen here. This is a very sort of old school way, even this was done in the late 15th century, old school way of doing donors, that they're these teeny tiny figures playing in at this momentous occasion. But here they are. Again, we don't know their name. Misere me Dio. So this is at the beginning of Psalm 50, Lord have mercy upon me. And it's believed this was done as a funerary piece, because obviously there's the Pietà and this notion of having mercy on one. You know, when do you need the mercy? Of course, in the next life. But it's very disproportionate. You've got this tender image of Mary cradling her son. And even though you see Christ suffering here it's much more emotional suffering from Mary. Christ is much more corpse-like here than he is here. But there's this beautiful gesture of her covering up the scar, the wound from Longinus' spear that you see so prominently here. And again, she's massive. So some of these elements from Italy crept into his work. It's believed this was done around this time based on the clothing. So, I mean, I know I talk a lot about clothes and fashion at the time, but this is actually an art historical tool of dating work. And then you've got this sort of faux Jerusalem in the back of both of these images. Okay. You can also see the difference in the pigments. And again, the word clunky is not really a great term, but it is kind of apt. If you see just sort of this translucent, elegant handling of the paint here, where you can see John the Baptist, the outline of his leg through his clothing, and just the shadows, the way that the light is caught, even in the knee of Mary here. And here you just have Mary just covered in textiles, and there's no, real definition to it. And here are two scenes from the same story. The flagellation from 1506, they're not from the same commission. But again, you have kind of a disproportionate sense of the body. This head is way too small. This guy who's got his foot on Christ's inner thigh, there's just a lot. It's a very discordant image, I think. It just lacks a lot of the refinement that you would see in a northern painting, or certainly an Italian painting. And the one on the right is much closer to both. And this one, you may remember, some of you may remember this. This is the Ecce Homo. It was a commission from the Cathedral of Ciudad Rodrigo in Salamanca. And this was part of a large altarpiece. This one is from the University of Arizona in Tucson. It came here about 10 years ago. So I know some of our longtime docents may remember it. But it was a really wonderful way to see this work up close. I know we have our Gallego here that we'll look at next week, but it's high up. And what really struck me when these were here was it was in some ways like paint by number. You got a real sense of the workshop, that it would say like amarillo, like paint yellow here. But still you get this sense of, again, northern in the clothing, and all of these compressed figures, but also sort of this, and really the perspective isn't that great here, but also a very elongated sense of the clothing and the shoes. So again, a bit of a hybrid. Now his figures tend to be stocky, kind of like the figures that you see in Dirk Bouts' paintings in this. And this painting was the altarpiece of the Deposition. Dirk Bouts was born in Haarlem, way up north, but ended up going to Louvain in modern-day Belgium. And so he came a bit further south. This particular altarpiece is, again, in this same chapel, the Royal Chapel in Granada, again, the burial place of Isabella and Ferdinand. So clearly, I imagine, based on what we know from Isabella and Ferdinand, that she was not somebody who just had a laissez-faire of, we'll just see what happens and we'll see what shows up in our chapel. She had a very clear idea of what she wanted and what her chapel was going to look like. So to have the work of a northern artist would have been very important to her. Now we're going to move sort of southeast of Salamanca to Avia, and the monastery of St. Thomas, monastery of Santo Tomas. And here we've got, this is really sort of, Pedro de Bourgogne really sort of had his wonderful kind of final foray in this chapel. He was in Avia from 1499 until his death in 1503. And the monastery was his primary patron at the time. And the monastery was patronized as the monastery of Santo Tomas. Another very important Tomas of the time, Fray Tomas de Torquemada, was the patron. And of course, he was the one who instituted the Inquisition in 1480. The monastery was also supported by Isabella and Ferdinand. It was the burial place for their son, Prince Juan, who died in 1497. And this gives you a sense of scale of this unbelievably gigantic altarpiece. And just to give you, we'll look at these two paintings, which again are a fusion of Italian. If you look at this beautiful St. Thomas Aquinas receiving the Dominican habit. We know it is the Dominican habit. They were the white monks. It's a white habit with a black hooded cloak that goes over it. And so here he's being invested. And these figures are pretty well proportioned to the space, right? I mean, when he gets up off his knees, he might be as tall, nearly as tall as this other father, but basically they're well proportioned to the space. Unlike this fabulous one of the Temptation of St. Thomas Aquinas, and temptation paintings are always far more interesting than kind of these holy images. But here you've got this seductress here about to leave his room, and he's praying hard to this cross, like, please save me from this temptress. And you've got these angels who are doing their best. They're tying this rope around his waist to just keep him chaste and keep him in place. And you see creeping out of the ceiling almost these demons who are just after him, but we know ultimately that he prevails. Now, if he were to stand up here, he would go straight through the ceiling. And so it's this mixed sense of spatial relations that really makes no sense, but it seems to vary from image to image. This is, again, you've got elements that sort of go back to Van Eyck here, again, of these figures that are too big for their surroundings. Now, Berruguete also painted the altars to St. Peter Martyr, which I did not bring any images of, but I did bring them one of images from the altar of St. Dominic. Now, this altarpiece has been broken apart. Some of these are at the Prado, and they are just sort of all over the place, as is the case with a lot of these, unfortunately. Where's St. Dominic from? One guess? Castile. He was a Castilian saint, so very, very important for this, of course, for this church. He's from the late 12th century, early 13th century. Patron saint of astronomers, which is kind of ironic. And because he makes a name for himself preaching against heretics. And, almost anything was considered a heresy. And so not insignificant that Torquemada would want Saint Dominic throughout his church. You will see fire in all of the images with Saint Dominic for a variety of reasons. So this was the central panel. It's in the Prado now. And when you look at it, what's the sense? What it looks like it's happening? Yeah. It looks like he's stabbing this is a dog, stabbing the dog to death. And the place is about to catch fire. Because even this staff that he's holding almost looks like the hilt of a sword, doesn't it? So it's sort of like a crucifix and weapon all in one. But in fact, the dog and the fire are one of his attributes. So the legend is that his mother was about to go to the abbey at Silos because she was barren. But prior to leaving, she had a dream of a dog carrying a flaming torch in its mouth. And this notion that she was going to have a child who would set the earth on fire. And so here you've got the dog and the earth being set on fire. And his name is Dominic, which comes from, any Latin scholars? Domine, Lord, Canis, dog. So the Lord's dog. And so in a very positive way, right? The Lord's dog, he's going to do the bidding of the Lord. Now, in the Middle Ages, people hated the Dominicans, and they considered them like the dogs of God, like the lowest rung. But obviously for this chapel, it was meant in the most polite way, in the most effusive way. Here we've got these two images that are very tied to current events. More or less, Saint Dominic and the Albigensians on the left. Now, the Albigensians were actually Cathars, and they were in southern France right around this time, obviously. And their whole thing was they wanted to go back to taking vows of poverty. They wanted to really be service-oriented. They wanted to reject physical comfort, and they did this as a way to reject what they saw as the corruption in the church at the time. The church was not too happy about this and persecuted them terribly. And so you've got people like St. Dominic. There was actually a crusade against them. So the Albigensian Crusade was against these priests in southern France, in the town of Albi. So here you've got St. Dominic again with fire, and to show them the error of their ways, he throws their books into this bonfire, and alas, his book is raised aloft. So right there, they should know that their ways are wrong. And then this really horrible, tragic, contemporary image that, again, has a very positive spin on it, because it's St. Dominic pardoning a heretic, seen here, St. Dominic there. So that's very nice. But what's happening here? Yeah, this is an auto de fe, one of these public burnings of heretics, which were very commonplace at the time. You can see these two unfortunate men are lashed to these stakes. They've got this post that's coming out right between their legs, and they're going to be, they are going to be set aflame, as will these two men. And here you've got the executioner. You can't really see it, but it is worth looking up this image to give yourself a nightmare. But the executioner who's going to be adding literally fuel to the fire with the wood, who's just so bored, like, I'm just doing my job. And then here, these prelates are asleep, they're bored, they're just doing their job, doing this every day, dealing with heretics. And again, this would have been something, again, for Torquemada, that would have been so close to home and so relevant, so current to what was going on. Now, I don't want to leave you, God forbid, with images of people being burned at the stake. That's a bad way to say goodbye for the week. So we will move on to the cathedral at Toledo, which another major cathedral, completed around 1493, again, once Spain was completely Christian, completed during the reign of Isabella and Ferdinand. And the man in charge of the cathedral was the Cardinal Archbishop Francisco Jimenez de Cisneros, who was a big patron of the arts and a confessor. And so you see, again, all of these elements that are going to come into play. Look at this unbelievable retablo. It was commissioned to Philippe De Bourgogne to come up with the design. So clearly he was not able to do all of this himself. There would have been a workshop to work through this with him. And he did a few of the pieces, but again, just like tremendous, still very Gothic-y, still very Italianate, and look how high off the ground Christ is. So even to be able to see these, even have these images photographed, in detail, is really important and significant for us, because mostly people would be seeing these off the ground. And to give you an idea, these are the chairs that sit at the altar. So we would be kind of where we are now. And I don't know, I'm sure some of you have been to this cathedral. Is it as overwhelming as I would imagine? But have you been to the chapter room there? It's been newly restored. As you can see, there's still scaffolding. So here you see sort of the before and after. And this is sort of the domain of Juan De Bourgogne, because at this point he was the last man standing. And so he was commissioned, he came to Spain in 1495, and he was commissioned to do these frescoes. Fresco painting, as you probably know, is pretty indigenous to Italy. Everywhere you go, all of those, the Sistine Chapel, fill in the blank, all the palazzi, all the villas, all the churches, all had frescoes. And this was a virtually unknown technique in the north. So even the fact that he's doing these in fresco is different and significant. Certainly, you know, again, if you've spent any time in the Netherlands, you know it rains all the time, which is sort of not conducive to fresco, because something like this, you know, fresco means fresh, right? So they would plaster the wall and have to paint on it immediately. So this is a spectacular commission. It was for not only the chapter room, but also the antechamber. And you can see it begins with really the Virgin, the Virgin's parents, Joaquin and Anna here, birth of the Virgin, and it goes all the way around, culminating in, you've got descent from the cross here, we'll see that in a moment, the Pietà, and the resurrection. And then you've also got this wonderful parade of bishops, a couple of cardinals in there, but it goes all the way around the room. And I love that they've hopefully left room to continue in perpetuity. And I wish I could tell you when they stopped painting these little panels of the prelates. But this, if you were just to look at this, say you were an art history lecturer and you were given this on an exam, you might think it's Florentine, right? Everything about it looks Florentine. You've got this perfect perspective. Oh. Beautiful, you know, the fabrics, it's a well-lit, it's a lighted, light, airy room. It's not one of these dark, little, compressed Flemish spaces. Beautifully rendered figures, nice shoes. Even this wonderful little crib for the baby, and then this wonderful little, you know, brazier in order to just keep the baby warm, which, you know, again, things we take for granted nowadays, but I think of it, at the time this was painted in late Middle Ages, you know, you've got to keep the baby warm, certainly if it's winter. And then this wonderful halo that sort of blends in with the wallpaper, as it were. And then even the ceiling, the frieze course on the ceiling, the coffered ceiling, this is all very Italian. You never see that in Northern Europe. But then you have things like this Pietà, which again is like all the other Pietàs we've seen tonight, very elongated Christ, stiffened body, really the rendering, the arm is too small, the head's too small, it just doesn't fit too well in, you know, it's just not a well-painted figure. The landscape is kind of Italian. You've got these old-fashioned early Renaissance halos, the sort of the plate halos here. But again, the figures are just not elegantly rendered, even the one in the Resurrection. And then this one also, which I think is another interesting hybrid, in that you've got this descent from the cross, and you've got Christ is being taken down, sort of you think almost maybe it's a silk cord that's gently taking him off of the cross. And we don't see Joseph in here either. My thinking is this is Joseph of Arimathea, who paid to have him taken down from the cross. You still have this T, this like Tau cross that we've been seeing all evening. And then these figures, you know, these beautifully rendered figures here that somehow putting clothes on them makes them, he does a better job with clothed figures. These guys are wearing Italian armor also. It's almost Florentine armor, and that was one of the things that Florence was renowned for, was its armor. So again, it's sort of a hybrid. And then finally, you know, you don't want to leave on a sort of a down note, but this spectacular Last Judgment, which is in the same room, also by Juan De Bourgogne, but that again is still medieval. He still has that Burgundy in him, because the figures here, let's face it, are less than idealized. You know, when you think of Italian Christs, when you think of Italian gods, Roman gods. They're beautifully depicted. These, not so much. And not only that, but just in case you're not sure why these folks are in hell, you've got all the bands, the little banderoles that have all the 7 sins on them. And then this council up here, the elders, again have the early Renaissance kind of plate-like halos on them. The cross is this very northern-looking cross that we've been seeing, but Christ is in this just spectacular glowing orb. He's what? Yeah, he is strange looking. Again, completely disproportionate. I mean, the arms are, I mean, you've got the gestures, but it's not Michelangelo, you know, who's like at the Sistine Chapel like this, or, you know, or blessing and blessing. It's just, welcome to the Last Judgment kind of thing. And then sitting on this also magnificent orb here that is well done. And then Mary and John the Baptist here. So we don't have Joseph, his father, here as well. Mm-hmm. Whoops, sorry about that. Those, I believe, are... No, well, these are, his feet are here on the earth. These are, you know how you see Mary being held up on the crescent? I think that's what this is. Yeah. Yeah. And then you've also got these wonderful little faces, these little putti here that you don't see that in Northern art ever, but these little disembodied putti's heads sitting here. But yeah, so you've got a lot of he's sort of thrown in every element he can here. And believe it or not, Juan De Bourgogne, whose work, again, we have upstairs and we will go see next week, becomes the leading painter in Toledo for the next 25 years. And he will end up monopolizing every single commission in Toledo. So northern artist, southern churches, and you had a recipe for the 15th and 16th century. But with the merging of the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, aided by the treasures that were flowing in from the New World, money was really not an object. And so the area becomes extremely wealthy. And really, in seeing what money can buy, they really are able to commission the best artists, bring them down, and as we saw in the case of Juan de Flan, pay them quite handsomely. This mixing of styles of these artists, there are Italian artists coming in as well, and certainly the northern artists, as I mentioned earlier, is going to start creating a unique blend that will be uniquely Spanish. And certainly next week, when we get to the Hapsburgs, we're going to start seeing the emergence of a Spanish painting. But you can see where people like Ribera never go back to Spain, because he says, why should I go to Spain? All they want are foreign artists, and we're seeing it here. Any questions or comments? Yeah. Oh boy. Which is the yeah. Nope. Nope. Was that it? No, that's not it. You know what? Let me see. I can do it this way. Ah, right. There we go. Both. Yeah. So you'll often see Mary in both, for blue for the faith and red for passion. And so I think he just, again, was just putting it all out there. You know what, rather, in the Miraflores Altarpiece, he had 3 different Marys, so it made sense to sort of clothe her in the 3 different stages of life. But I think when he was just, when Gallego was just doing this one altarpiece, he was going to just do the combination, and you'll often see her, especially in Italy, wearing a red dress with a blue cloak over it. Yeah. Anything else? Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I'll see you next week.